Of course, we have to talk about the development of the skeletal system, starting in the embryo. And a big fancy term for that is osteogenesis. If you take a look at the word osteogenesis, it tells you exactly what it means. Osteo for bone, genesis for giving rise to. So this process is giving rise to bone. Ossification is when you take the connective tissue model and change that from connective tissue into bone. The skeleton of the embryo is really not a skeleton because it's going to be composed of these connective tissue membranes that are sort of loosely shaped like bones. If you've ever seen on a cartoon character given an X-ray, these sort of cartoon-like shaped bones that you see on that X-ray or look a whole heck of a lot like the so-called skeleton of an embryo. Very roughly shaped, vaguely shaped structures that vaguely look like the bones they're supposed to turn into. That will provide supporting structures for ossification, which will start at about 6 or 7 weeks of gestation. It does continue until adulthood, and after that, bones are continually broken down and repaired, and bone matter is replaced, bone matrix is replaced, and that process is known as remodeling. If you remember when we talked about the anatomy of the long bone, we talked about the epiphyseal plate, the growth plate. When that seals, the person is skeletally mature. And we're going to be talking about that in just a few more slides. So in ossification, you replace the pre-existing connective tissue model or membrane with bone. And there are 2 patterns that you absolutely positively need to know about. If you know the material on this slide, you will know 80 to 90% of any questions I might ask on an assessment about ossification. Let's take a look at the 2 names: intramembranous ossification and endochondral ossification. Intramembranous ossification. Intra for within, membranous for membrane, and sure enough, this is going to happen within a connective tissue membrane. So the bone is going to form on or within a fibrous connective tissue membrane, and the flat bones that you know all about now are going to form through intramembranous ossification. So skull bones like the parietal bone, like the temporal bone, are going to form through intramembranous ossification. The clavicles, the ribs, the scapula, they will all form through intramembranous ossification. Endochondral ossification. Endo for within, chondral for cartilage, and sure enough, bone forms through this method of ossification because the very first supporting structure is going to be a hyaline cartilage model or template. Most of the bones of the skeleton are going to be formed through endochondral ossification. If it is not a flat bone, it's going to form through endochondral ossification. And you need to be able to tell me on an assessment whether a bone is part of the axial or appendicular skeleton, which we'll review when we're going over the actual bones, and whether or not it arises through intramembranous ossification or endochondral ossification. So a little bit more detail on endochondral ossification. We know that there is a model or template of hyaline cartilage that has to be developed by chondrocytes. Those chondrocytes are going to be replaced by osteoblasts, who will start to create spongy bone. There is what's known as a primary ossification center in the diaphysis. And as that forms, periosteum is actually going to start to form around the diaphysis. Bone growth is going to start at that primary ossification center and will move towards both epiphyses. Each epiphysis will have its own ossification center, the secondary ossification centers, which are going to form both spongy bone and the trabeculae associated with that spongy bone. This shows you what's happening. You can see that the very first step in formation of most bones is going to be that hyaline cartilaginous model. The periosteum develops at the same time that cartilage starts to calcify. calcify. The compact bone is going to develop. Meanwhile, the periosteum is growing and developing around the bone. You can see the primary ossification center in the figure that is labeled C. The secondary ossification centers appear after that. There'll be one in each epiphyses, which we talked about. And you can also see the epiphyseal plate there on between both epiphyses and the diaphysis, in that metaphyseal area. So if you think about it, that epiphyseal plate is actually a remnant, or those epiphyseal plates, because there are two of them, one at each end of the bone, is a remnant of that original hyaline cartilage model, which is kind of cool. Again, once the growth plates are sealed, you have a skeletally mature adult, which you see in the figure marked F. Again, with intramembranous ossification, we know they're going to be sheets of fibrous connective tissue, which is the initial supporting structure. Osteoblasts are going to form spongy bone, and compact bone will form around that spongy bone. You will remember when we talk about the components of flat bone, there is a layer of compact bone, and then there's a layer of spongy bone, and then there's going to be a layer of compact bone again. These bones are quite thin, and again, flat bones arise through this method of ossification. This tells you what's happening. It's more detailed than you absolutely positively need to know. But you can see in that picture on the far right of this diagram that you have two layers of compact bone with spongy bone in the middle. So this is actually pretty interesting. And before we end this section, we're going to talk tiny little bit about this. The two videos that are listed at the bottom of this slide are quite detailed, but very interesting and worth a watch. It's how much force does it take to break a bone is also quite interesting, and I would definitely watch that. The amount of stress that bones undergo is tremendous. Compression is a major force, and for example, if you're standing up and walking around, your vertebrae are being compressed. Tension, bones start to get pulled apart because of the fact that muscles pull on them. Sometimes you have torsion or twisting because of the way that we move, and shear is tearing apart or tearing across. Remember that one of the main components of bone is collagen. And once that collagen matrix is laid down, or that osteoid is laid down, which is mostly collagen, the mineral salts form around that. So that collagen has very, very high tensile strength, which is one of the reasons that bone can take as much wear and tear and stress as we put on it.